Howdy, everybody. Today we're doing a Q&A on slavery in the ancient world. And by that, I primarily mean the classical world of Greece and Rome, since my specialty is on European history. um, the Q&A has been posited, questions have been posited by friends, colleagues, family, in order to, because we don't have a large number of followers yet, we can't do the Reddit thing, which I would love to do. Although this does allow me to weed out the more ridiculous questions, so that's nice. But I did leave some in there for. But yeah, so there are a lot of questions about African history, which is fair because it's our only real comparison we know. So we are going to get some into African history, just simply because of that. So here we go. What kinds of people were used as slaves in the ancient world? All kinds, of every race, of every gender, right? So everybody is going to be enslaved: children, women, men. The Romans and Greeks were equal opportunity enslavers, if you will. But yeah, what kind of slaves? What kind of jobs did slaves perform back then? In the beginning of Rome and in Greece, you could have one of the primary forms was debt bondage. It's a precarious pact a poor person takes with a rich noble, right, or a wealthy person, and they take out a loan. The loan doesn't work out, and all of a sudden you're enslaved to this person you took the loan from for a certain period of years. And that's going to be the primary way Rome gets its slaves for a while, and this is while it's still a small number of slaves in that society at the time. Later in the 3rd century BC, debt bondage is going to be outlawed in Rome, and other forms of slavery are going to become far more common. Children could be sold by their families as slaves if they were poor. Like, I can't afford this child, I'll just sell him to you. As crazy as that sounds. Criminals could also be turned into slaves as punishment. Kidnappers and pirates also supplied slaves, and that's going to be true throughout the Middle Ages too. Children who were born to parents that were slaves also became slaves upon birth. By far the most common way someone became a slave in Greece or in Rome was via conquest. Now in Rome, that's going to take on a whole new meaning because they're going to conquer a lot of stuff, and Rome's success is going to be built on the plunder that it steals, and the amount of slaves it gets is going to provide the backbone of their workforce. The Romans are going to be a slave society. So the Romans are going to conquer a place, whether it be Dacia or Britain or Germania or Hispania, as in Spain, and they're going to be breaking them in from there. It's captured peoples. To give you an idea of this, Julius Caesar reportedly captured over 1 million slaves in Gaul, which is modern France, in 58 BC. In 1 year, captured over 1 million slaves. 58 to 51 BC. So over a 7-year period, 1 million slaves. About 20 to 30% of the people in Rome were slaves. It gives you an idea how big of a slave society it was. It was very much like the early United States in that way. What is the biggest difference between African and ancient slavery? And this is a really good thing, a good comparison, because your average person, including myself before I learned, really got in depth about studying this stuff, when you think of slavery, you think of the slavery that occurred in the United States. And it was primarily Africans being, enslaved. So that is a good question. While the ancient world, if you're talking about in terms of like treatment of slaves, the ancient world is just as harsh, but there, slavery is bad in any form. Ancient slaves had a better prospect of working their way towards emancipation, if that makes sense, and using their trade skill to make money. And with African slavery that occurred in the New World, there was one of two occupations essentially for this slave, or jobs they would perform. One would be working on a plantation. The other would be working as a household servant, right? Or a maid, like a under-glorified maid or butler, if you will. That does not bode well for future career prospects if one was to become emancipated, right? But slaves in the ancient world were in a wide variety of roles they would perform. Some really terrible, like really terrible, and others were a little bit cushy. Secretaries, right? You could be a secretary, slave, and you'd be someone's secretary, a lord or noble secretary. You could be a gladiator. You could be thrown into a pit and eaten by a jaguar. You could be a farmer, right? Agriculture. Gardeners. You could be a gardener for somebody. That's way better than the farming, right? Cooks. You could be a cook. You could be a nurse. Not so bad. Seamstress, right? Or a laundress. A butler. A hairdresser. A teacher. A tutor. A miner. Really bad. A midwife. A house servant, or a factory worker. They're not great, but it does go to show that there was a wide variety of roles a slave could perform. And one of them was, particularly some are good. A seamstress, a teacher, a tutor, a secretary. Those were good ones. And that person could, because emancipation was a thing back then, someone could turn a pretty tidy career out of that later on. Same thing with a blacksmith. Somebody works as a blacksmith apprentice for 15 years. In a way, it's a prolonged internship. They graduate from that, move on to better things. The Roman Columella wrote that the city slave, and this is what we're talking about, the cushier jobs, is a lazy and sleepy type of slave who is accustomed to having a lot of time on his hands, to lounging around the campus Martius, the Circus Maximus, the theaters, the gambling dens, the snack bars, and the brothels. So it sounds like the city slave, you could have instances where slaves had far greater autonomy. They got to hang out, they got to chill, they got some free time. So in that way, in some ways, ancient slavery is going to be nicer than African slavery, depending on what role you're assigned to and who your master is and if they're nice or not. What was the worst type of slavery back then? Mining, easily mining. The conditions were appalling, literally backbreaking. Slaves were literally worked to death. For instance, we have here Diosorus Siculus writes of his findings at a Roman silver mine. They are physically destroyed. Many die because of the excessive maltreatment they suffer. They are given no rest or break from their toil, but are rather forced by the whiplashes of their overseers to endure the most dreadful of hardships. Thus, they do wear out their lives in misery. We certainly know we talk about awful forms of slavery. That's one of them is going to be the mining and plantation work, as we know about from the later African slavery. How were slaves treated? It's a case-by-case basis and entirely dependent on who the master is, right? For instance, the slave Apuleius writes that when the day was nearly over and I was completely exhausted, they undid the ropes attaching me to the millstone, removed my harvest, and tied me up to the manger. He continues describing the condition of the slaves at the mill. Their skin everywhere was embroidered with purple welts from their many beatings. Their backs scarred from floggings. All of them, decked out in rags, carried brands, right, on their forehead. A symbol had been burned into their forehead. and they had their heads half shaved and wore chains around their ankles. That's the worst of it. But we do have people, when we look at Odysseus in the Greek world, we look at the Odyssey. Odysseus has been gone for 20 years trying to get back to Ithaca, his home kingdom from the Trojan War. When he arrives, there is a slave there who is a cowherder who sees Odysseus, and once Odysseus reveals himself to be Odysseus, the slave is overjoyed. He considers Odysseus a long-lost family, long-lost friend. And when we look at this ancient world, especially when we talk about ancient Greece, there's not really coinage yet, certainly not for poor people. If I was a free person, I may not have a place to live. I may not get 3 meals a day, things like that. And so a lot of people poor people would seek to attach themselves to someone who was wealthy, and do work for them. And in exchange, they would get food, 3 meals a day, they get a house, they get shelter. They work for them some of the day, and then they could work for themselves some of the day, selling sheep wool. So it was just very different back then, in the ancient Greek world. So you could have, masters that were kind to slaves, and you could have them really bad to them. Were gladiators really slaves? Yes, they were. You have a few that are professional gladiators. Most are going to be talking about Rome getting most of their slaves via conquest, right? Especially once they had become officially an empire. Most of these slaves are going to come from Britannica or Britain, Gaul, France, Germania, Germany, Dacia, Romania, and they're going to come and they're going to bring them down into Rome and the Roman Empire proper. Gladiators are primarily going to be enemy combatants that were captured of defeated armies, and these individuals are going to be thrown into the arena, right? Their life of slavery doesn't last long, because it's they're going to be. You talk about human sacrifice and stuff like that, and the Romans more or less were practicing human sacrifice, right? They turned human sacrifice into a sporting event, and they would kidnap these poor people, imprison them, and then throw them into the arena to be eaten by jaguars or lions or panthers, or fight against a trained gladiator, right, to the death. And of course, these are people who are not trained soldiers, so it'd be the equivalent of like someone like me or you having to fight Achilles to the death. Well, how do you think that's going to go? Not well, right? So that's a pretty bad form of slavery, right? Were people racist back then? Yes. So it's actually a popular narrative that racism is a modern invention. That's absolutely not true, and it's the furthest thing from the truth. The racism we have today is a modern invention because how we think of race is a modern invention. Ancient people thought of race very differently, okay? But that doesn't mean they didn't have their own form of... Their racism looked different, if that makes sense. But it doesn't mean it wasn't there. For instance, genetically, I'm Scottish, right? So if you were to sit me on a couch with an Italian guy, and you looked at us both, you might say, hey, they're both white. That isn't how they would think in the ancient world. They say, he's a Briton, this guy is a Roman. They're different people. They're different races. And they did think of themselves as different races. The Romans certainly did. Many people certainly did. They'd say racist things about Germanic people and their blonde and orange hair. And there's white people weren't just white people. There was no white people. It was You got the Romans, you got the Greeks, you got the Gauls, you got the Germans, you got the Celts, you got the Britons, you got the Dacians and the Thracians, and you have all these different people, and they're all different races, right? To people back then. So a very different world, but yes, they are racist. The Romans are racist against the Germans. They're racist against pretty much all the other European peoples they come into contact with. They're not that racist, though, against people from the Middle East or who are African. They're mostly going to be more angry at other European peoples. Later on in the Middle Ages, you have, with the Mongolian invasion of Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans are going to be very racist against Mongolians, right? Because every time they see someone who's Mongolian, they're seeing the Mongolian army who's slaughtering everyone, right? So they're going to be racist. So yes, many racist things are going to be said, and so people were definitely racist back then, even though their interpretation of race was very different than our modern one. Did anybody think slavery was wrong? Try to abolish it. So absolutely. With African slavery, you see that in the beginning of when it was happening, there's a few people who object, right? And then over time, that grows and grows and grows and grows until it's a big, strong movement towards emancipation that eventually, triumphs and ends slavery. You do kind of see that in Rome, like this slow movement of people object to it, and the objections get stronger, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it grows, right? Frankly, if I believe the Roman Empire hadn't fallen in 476, if it would have allowed to continue, eventually emancipation would have occurred. All slaves would be free, because they were certainly on that path by the end of the empire. Seneca writes, and this is near the end of the empire, he congratulates him for being on friendly terms with his slaves. This attitude is quite in keeping with your good sense and your liberal education. The essence of my advice: treat those of lower social rank as you wish to be treated by those of higher rank. Emperor Hadrian has passed a law forbidding masters from killing their slaves. Eventually, he's going to pass that, forbidding a master from requiring a slave to fight wild animals in the arena unless he's been, a slave that's been put to death for a crime. Emperor Theodosius is going to chastise the slave trade, and I quote, "Who can tolerate that children should be separated from parents, sisters from brothers, wives from husbands?" And he's gonna pass a law that ceases slave families from being able to be separated. Roman jurists in the end would eventually come to the epiphany that according to our code of law, slaves are considered non-entities. Right? They're not human beings. However, this belief is not valid under natural law, because according to the law of nature, all men are created equal, right? And so that is a very, a big realization for them. But throughout time, there's plenty of people in the Roman Empire, especially early on, advocating for the rights of slaves and saying, you can't beat your slaves to death. These are, they may not be people like you and me, right? This is how they would see it. They may not be real people, but they're still kind of people. You can't just go around beating them. They do shed tears, stuff like that. And so that was kind of how they would think. And so people would slowly begin standing up for, you can't just go murder your own slaves. You can't just do that to people. You can't just go buy this woman just to rape her and then do whatever you want with her. And so over time, you do see more and more people fighting for the rights of slaves, to be treated as human in general. And we're not so much talking about abolishing slavery. They're not so much interested in that yet, but they have gotten to the point where they are fighting for slaves' rights to be treated as human, to not be beaten to death, to not, hey, you can't just go kill that other guy's slave. That's mean. You can't do that, right? And so the Romans are beginning to see people as slaves as human beings, which is going to really help help them in general. It's, thank God somebody was standing up. People were standing up for them. At least some people were. And that they did get laws passed that made things a little more humane. But I think if the Roman Empire had been allowed to continue, eventually you would have seen a full emancipation, as we did in our society. Were Roman slave owners meaner to their slaves than slave owners in the American period? Well, okay, so it's not. It's a difficult question because it's not really fair to compare human tragedies to each other. It's never a game you win at. Rome is a very interesting place because we think of Rome as civilized, and they are in some ways. They're very orderly. There's an establishment. They have a solid government. They've got all these laws. Everything's orderly and organized. The Roman nobility, however, could be extremely barbaric, extremely sadistic. And it's ironic because they refer to all these other people, the Britons or the Germanic peoples or the Dacians, as being barbarians or savages because they're simple, right? Or they're simpler. But in reality, the real savages are going to be the Romans. They're going to be the barbaric ones. There's just such cruelty and sadism. A culture of such creative sadism in Rome, very twisted. They didn't just kill people, they had to crucify them. All sorts of terribly creative ways of torture. I mean, we're talking about a place where slaves were thrown into an arena with jaguars and lions to be eaten. Here's an example. Pliny the Elder writes of a Roman nobleman, Vettius Pollio. He used to toss slaves to death into ponds of lampreys. Not because wild animals on land were not capable of killing a slave, but because with any other type of animal, he was not able to enjoy the sight of a man being torn to pieces completely in one moment. Very disturbing. So this Roman noble, slaves back-talk him, they get thrown into this pond of lampreys. Lampreys are these eels that look like they're from an Alien movie. So they're flat, they got a head like this, and then they got a bunch of teeth all lined in a circular row, and they just eat you, and it's absolutely terrifying. A horrific way to die. And that gives you an idea of the level of sadism and cruelty that the Romans are capable of. But yeah, generally speaking, the treatment of a slave in either African slavery or in ancient slavery is entirely dependent on who the master is, whether they're a good person or a bad person, right? And well, that makes you think. And this is an important question to ask everybody to think about. Is it possible for a slave owner to be a decent person? And that's really weird to think about, because you do have slave owners that treat their slaves really well. They'll treat them like family. And then you'll have others that are just brutalizing them, raping them, molesting them, beating them to death, torturing them for fun. So clearly there's a very big difference between those two types of people. So even when we say, which is true, slavery is evil, slavery is wrong, even when we get to that point, there's very different levels of it, right? And so it's good to ask ourselves, and it's a really difficult concept for a modern person like us to wrap our head around, because we hate slavery. Like, slavery is evil, obviously. And just to get in the mindset of an ancient person is really difficult, because it's just such a radically different reality that I live in. Can someone who is a slave owner be a good person? And Can someone who is racist be a good person? Can someone who is sexist be a good person? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that myself. I struggle with it, but it's something good to think about, because I think what it means is, because I mean, you read about historical figures like Winston Churchill was racist, right? And he saved the world. He saved so many people. He saved the world, right? But he was racist, and that doesn't make sense. How do these things work together? And you read about all these historical figures who, might have owned slaves or were or something along those lines, who owned slaves. But you read about them, and like, they're doing all these great things. They're doing all these nice charitable things for people, and then you discover they own slaves, and you're just like, what? How do I map my mind around this? So, definitely an interesting, I don't have an answer, that's for sure, but definitely something interesting to think about. And I think what it means is that the human morality is extremely complex. It's not a simple thing at all, and the human condition is a very complex one. And ultimately, I think that's what it means. But yeah, I don't have an answer for that question. I don't think we need to have an answer for it. It's just something to think about, and sometimes a question without answers, you learn more from that, just from getting the wheels turning like that. How prevalent was slavery back then? In Rome, about 20-30% of people were slaves. But slavery was incredibly ingrained to every society. We got the map here. Point to anywhere you want on the map, and yeah, they had slaves. Okay. Every people is gonna. In fact, slavery is going to be so endemic to humanity that I would be willing to wager, because this has been going for tens and tens of thousands of years. I would wager that everyone alive today or nearly everyone alive today can find in their ancestry an individual who owned slaves and an individual who was a slave. Right? You can find both. I think every person somehow has an ancestor who was both, and that's simply because of how popular and common slavery was, how endemic it is to human society throughout time. And the crazy thing about slavery, when I try to find a positive in all of this, is that we have something that started, probably 10,000 years ago, or even further back, right? So this is the beginning of human civilization. And it was always considered a fact of life, right? We were able to overcome that. Something that had been with us since the beginning for tens of thousands of years. We as humanity were able to overcome what we once considered just a fact of life, something we all just had to deal with. We were able to overcome that. And so it gives me hope for the future that if we were able to overcome that, what else are we able to overcome? What else are we able to accomplish? Because it really is quite the triumph. I mean, it's horrific that it happened. It's terrible it went on for so long. But when you think about it, it's amazing we ended it because it did go on for so long. Let's see, what's next? Did slaves ever rebel? Yes, they did. In the ancient world, right? Every slave, frequently rebelled or tried to escape. Not every slave, but many slaves did. I mean, in Rome, every slave wore a collar with an inscription upon it dictating the names of the master. The reward was listed for their return and where to return them to. Right? And professional slave hunters made a living going out and trying to find these guys that had escaped, to grab them, return them, receive the big bounty. Given the Romans' way they treated slaves, cruel masters could treat slaves, it's not surprising that if they were unable to escape, they chose to openly revolt. There were many revolts, slave revolts in the Roman Empire. The Romans would try to deter slave revolts by dishing out even more cruelty, even more horrendous punishments, such as crucifixion. If a widespread revolt occurred, all of them would be crucified. There would be no survivors. Spartacus is a famous example of a slave revolt in 135 BC. There was also a law that if a slave killed a master, rebelled and killed his master, by law, all of the murdered master's slaves were to be put to death. A common Roman view on slaves is expressed by Pliny the Younger, who commented on one such incident. When a slave murdered the master who had tortured him, no one can feel safe, even if he is a lenient and kind master. Slaves are ruined by their own evil natures, not by a master's cruelty. So you have very different views, like and you even have this in African slavery. Hey, we should treat our slaves like humans. They are people. They are good people. Let's treat them like family, loyalty, respect, stuff like that. On the other hand, you have people who don't see their slaves as human, just are sadistic people who are like, hey, I got somebody I can torture. This will be fun. And they really think that way, right? So you have these two very different camps of how they see their slaves. And then we talked about the good master and the bad master. You really do see that in that with how people are treated. On one hand, you might have a guy who treats his slave well, gives him lots of nice things, gives him lots of free time, lets him sell his own stuff if he wants to part-time, and allows him to get married, have a wife and kids, give him a nice house. And after 10 or 15 years of working for him, he'll give him his emancipation. Like, yeah, you're free to go. Hey, thanks. You're great. We're going to stay friends. It blows your mind. It's hard to think about, but there are people who think that way. People who were masters like that. And then others who were just sadistic and cruel and had no problem beating their slaves to death if they gave them the wrong look. And so there's two very different masters we're seeing here in historical examples. What countries participated in slavery? All of them. How did ancient slavery end? It evolved, but it didn't disappear. As we mentioned, Roman Empire was a slave society built on the backs of slaves. And when the Roman Empire finally died in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire did, there goes your slave society, and your only slave society in Europe. And so, in a way that ended in, so the number of slaves in Europe is going to be really, really small after that for a long time. Then we have what we call serfdom, the creation of serfdom. It's going to occur in getting into the Dark Ages, Middle Ages. And serfdom is I compare it to, I consider it a form of slavery. It's a little nicer than straight up slavery, but I consider it a form of slavery. So that's going to go on until the discovery of the New World. Okay, and once the New World is discovered, well, let's preface this by saying the New World is discovered by Portugal and Spain, where Portugal and Spain are going to get their slaves for this workforce, for their colonization in the New World. Well, the map's not kind of lower, but Africa, it's right there. It's right there, just a little 30, 40-mile trip down the coast. You pick up your slaves, take off to the New World. There you go. I mean, African slavery didn't begin via racism. It began due to geographical convenience of why they were selected as to be slaves. And over time, obviously, it picks up some really heavy racism involved in there, but it didn't start that way. Let's see. We have any other questions? I don't see them. I don't see any other questions, so I guess that concludes this video. I hope we learned some today about ancient slavery. Oh, one of the really awful jobs in ancient slavery was a rower of a galley. Right, you'd be underneath the galley and you just row constantly all day on a warship or something else. And that was a really awful form of ancient slavery. So you have, in the ancient slavery world, you have the best and worst of slavery, right? You have where my job could literally be to sew a tapestry, and in 10 years I get my independence and I can make a lot of money selling tapestries or crafting swords or other things. And then on the other side of it, you have masters throwing their slaves to lampreys to be eaten alive by eels, or eaten by a jaguar or a lion or a crocodile in an arena with thousands of people cheering. Or being crucified and just horribly tortured for fun. So, or being forced to work in a mine where your life expectancy was a couple months maximum, but you should fall over dead from being worked to death. So slavery in the ancient world varies very, very widely, and there didn't seem to be too much of a racial component to it. There was some. Generally speaking, the Romans preferred what they considered barbarian peoples to be their slaves. So it's primarily going to be other European peoples, like Greeks. And the Greeks were considered better than other people, and so they would typically be tutors or teachers, is where they'd be enslaved to be a tutor or a teacher, which is pretty cushy occupation. But someone like a Germanic person or a Briton or a Dacian or a Thracian might be employed, maybe forced to be a gladiator or to work on a plantation or work as a miner, etc. Right? Generally speaking, if a Roman was enslaved or a Greek was enslaved, they little fancier job like a tapestry worker apprentice or a blacksmith apprentice or a tutor. They might they might bring on a slave as a tutor to teach their kids something, which is something you can turn into a career after you have achieved your emancipation. So very different, very similar in some ways to African slavery, the slavery we know the most about because it's obviously the most recent, and also very different at the same time. But thank you all. That was all the questions we had. I hope we enjoyed this and found it interesting and learned some things along the way. Hope you enjoyed it, and there will be more videos in the future. Thank you very much.